Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for this very important discussion focusing on U.S. policy towards Somalia and Somali Americans under the current Trump administration. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar. We are very happy to be organizing this event in partnership with the African Studies program at Georgetown University. Many thanks to Professor Lara Smith and her team at the African Studies program for collaborating with us on putting on this event. And thanks to my colleagues at Arab Center Washington, D.C., who helped in the planning. For those not familiar with Arab Center Washington, D.C., just briefly, we are an independent research organization based in Washington, D.C., focusing on the study of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, with special attention to issues of human rights, democracy, and just and peaceful resolution to conflict. And since our establishment in 2015, our mission has been to offer Arab and indigenous perspectives to U.S. policy conversations and to center issues of human security and rights-based approaches to policymaking. This is why today's topic is very important for us. Over the past 2 decades, U.S. policy towards Somalia has been marked by frequent military strikes, which have taken place under both Republican and Democratic administrations from George W. Bush to Obama, Trump, and Biden. These military operations, framed usually as targeting the Islamic State and Al-Shabaab, have intensified and expanded under the current Trump administration, with little discussion about any U.S. strategy or long-term interests, or about the transparency and effectiveness of this primarily military approach. More importantly, no consideration has been given to the implications for the people of Somalia, particularly the civilians. Meanwhile, Somalia continues to face compounding challenges, including humanitarian crisis, worsening economic conditions, governance and constitutional changes, and human rights abuses, all while external regional actors continue to exploit the countries to advance their own divergent agendas and interests. This is all happening at the same time while here at home in the United States, the Trump administration has waged a different war against immigrant communities and people of color, including Somali Americans, especially with the recent events in Minnesota, all of which have raised very serious questions about civil liberties, democratic principles, and the rights of citizens and residents in the United States. That's why we sought to organize this event, and we are fortunate to have with us this excellent panel of scholars and experts to weigh in and discuss these policies and assess their implications. I would like to thank all the speakers on behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C. and the African Studies program at Georgetown University for joining us and for offering their time and insights. It's also my pleasure at this time to introduce the moderator for today, Lara Smith. Lara Smith is Associate Professor in the African Studies program and the Department of Government. She is also the Director of the African Studies program, all at Georgetown University. Professor Smith is a political scientist who studies citizenship, migration, and political institutions in Africa, particularly in East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Thank you, Lara, for this partnership with Arab Center Washington, D.C., and for chairing the discussion. I will now turn it over to you to begin the conversation. Lara.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you to you and your colleagues at the Arab Center. I really just want to echo that appreciation. These are really important kinds of partnerships between academic institutions like Georgetown and independent research organizations like the Arab Center to really take on important topics globally and regionally that are underappreciated, underdiscussed, with such amazing scholars and researchers such as we have today, so that we're not overlooking important topics in the rush of each day's news. So we're really delighted for this partnership today, and I hope it can continue as well. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we all want to get to the speakers, but I want to echo just a few things that Tamara said that sort of animate the reasons for today's discussion. I want to say that we're really here today because the people of Somalia, as well as the large and dynamic Somali diaspora, both within the Horn of Africa and across East Africa, across Europe, and closer to home here in the United States, matter to us. And just because these topics are typically discussed only within the context of US security or immigration policy, or not at all, does not mean that the Somali people, wherever they are, do not deserve to have the fullness of their own history, their present realities, and their future dreams considered. That is a tiny part of what we hope to discuss in the short time we have today. As many of us know on this call, and as Tamara has outlined so well, the current regime in the United States has intensified an already brutal and rarely reported on US military campaign in Somalia. But even more strikingly, it's ramped up a racist and inflammatory rhetoric against US Representative Ilhan Omar and the Somali American community, not only in Minnesota, but in other parts of the United States as well, although certainly the focus has sometimes appeared to be concentrated in Minnesota, but in other places, in Maine and other places where relatively large communities of Somalis live. Also, more recently now, threatening to end temporary protected status as well for Somali Americans. And all of this occurring, as we are well aware, in a context of a massive shift in regional geopolitics, one that widened even in the last week as we were putting the final touches on this panel today. And so when on December 26, 2025, Israel became the first country to formally recognize Somaliland, it was really high time for us to start to put all of these threads together and to have this conversation for today. And really that's also in the context of a region in the Horn of Africa that's already got its own strains and pressures in terms of regional conflict, even before the events of the last 10 days or so. So again, I'm really not going to take up more time. We all know why we're here, but let me just say that those of us in the African studies and those of us who study the Horn of Africa really always want to spend more time talking about Somalia. So we're delighted that you all on this call also see the importance. I want to make a quick note to our audience members. You don't have to wait until the Q&A period. We will try to save at least 15 minutes for that at the end. But while we're talking, please submit your questions to each of the speakers or to the panel broadly in the Q&A portion at any time in Zoom, or you can also email at events@arabcenterdc.org, and we'll get to some of those questions as much as we can. I'm going to introduce all of the panelists very briefly at the beginning, and then they will just proceed through their discussion as we go. I'm only going to say just their title, but if you want to look up their very impressive biographies on your own, I encourage you to do so because so much more could be said about the incredible research and activism that they're doing. I'll start with our first speaker, who will be Mohammed Abu Maya. He's an assistant professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. He will be followed by Samar Al-Bulushi, associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. She will be followed by Iman Mohammed, who's President's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Department of History at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And then finally, Dr. Michael Waldemariam, Associate Professor and PhD Program Director, School of Public Policy and Senior Fellow at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. Welcome all of you. Again, my thanks to starting, and we'll start with you, Professor Abu Maya.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introductions, and I'm honored to be a part of this panel. Respect the work of my fellow panelists here. I'll just begin by really talking about the Somali American experience as someone who is a Somali American and has done more than a decade of research on the Somali American community in San Diego, really to highlight that this level of surveillance and assault on Somali Americans is not new, right? When I was doing my research as a graduate student, in 2011, you saw the Somali American community in San Diego really be targeted for counterterrorism by the San Diego Police Department at the time, FBI, under the guise that Somali Americans were being recruited by Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization in Somalia, from San Diego, and that this community should be under target for surveillance, right? And so this involved people sending confidential informants into Somali communities, wiretapping, arrests, disappearances of people, but also daily interactions and encounters with Islamophobia and racist sort of rhetoric. So for me, it's really difficult to talk about the targeting of Somali Americans without really, and I know the other panelists are going to speak about this, without really talking about the U.S.'s long relationship to Somalia, right? That goes as far back as the U.S.'s relation with the budding dictatorship, right, and the military invasion. But what this moment of Trump's comments about Somalis Americans really also highlights is that as long as there has been the surveillance and assault on the community, there's been resistance and activism and organizing among Somali Americans. So that's really what I wanted to highlight in my work and my ethnography was it was really young Somali youth activists who are organizing around issues of Islamophobia, police violence, and targeting of Somalis in San Diego, right, which is the height of U.S. empire, right, with Marine Base Camp Pendleton, all these military bases, right, and as well as the third largest Somali community in the United States outside of Minneapolis and Columbus. And it was really these youth activists that were exposing some of the atrocities committed by the state that really wasn't visible in the news, right, or made aware to folks, right. And so they were really making this linkages between, at the time, San Diego Police Department training at Camp Pendleton, the relation between the military and the police working together under sort of arguing that it should be the job of the police to do the work of counterterrorism, right? And and so, part of my work was also tracing, this discrimination towards Somalis, and I argued part of the fact that there was such a small population in San Diego relative to the broader Muslim population or the broader Black population was really the intersectional identity Somalis occupied, right? Being Black at a time of when Somalis' arrival in San Diego in the early '90s, the height of the war on drugs and hyper criminalization of Black people, and as a Muslim population that became a target of Islamophobia and counterterrorism, right, at the height of the war on terror, right? And so Somalis really made visible the relationships between the criminalization of Black people, right, and the dehumanization and targeting of Muslim communities in the United States as well, right? But also really became broad activists who brought together the idea that BLM, Black Lives Matter movements, and organizing for justice in Palestine and around Islamophobia, the need for solidarity and cross-racial solidarity, and the emergence of sort of an increasingly authoritarian state, right? And so these young activists were organizing in various spaces, immigrant spaces, Muslim activist spaces, and BLM spaces. And so I really wanted to highlight not just the Somalis as objects of violence, right? But Somalis at the center of various forms of resistance, right? And possibilities for a future that's immigrant centric, right? That values Black lives and that values the lives of Muslims. So I won't take up too much of my time and let the other panelists provide historical and global context.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those themes in the Q&A for sure. Summer, yeah, please. Professor Al-Balushi.
Hi, everyone. A big thank you to the organizers for making today's conversation possible, and I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with my fellow panelists. So I'm going to be giving some of the history that Mohammed just referenced, looking at the history of U.S. militarism and imperialism in Somalia. And I think, the place that we can start really is with a very clear understanding of the fact that Somalia has been the site of a US-led undeclared war for 20 years. In many ways, you could argue that Somalia has served as a laboratory for US-led unchecked endless war, dating back to December 2006, when the US backed an Ethiopian-led invasion that toppled the government. It was under the Obama administration, as Lara mentioned a few minutes ago, that a significant US drone and airstrike campaign began. And then when Trump came into office in 2017, he expanded the discretionary authority of the US military to bomb Somalia. Some of you may recall that when Biden was campaigning, he campaigned on a promise to bring an end to endless war, but ultimately he maintained rather than reversed the policies of his predecessors. And then when Trump returned to the White House last year, we've seen since then a dramatic escalation in drone strikes, over 100 in 2025 alone, far more than were carried out during the administrations of Bush, Obama, and Biden combined. So in the midst of the US-Israel assault on Iran, Somalia, I think, serves as a really important reminder that US presidents have been engaged in wars without congressional approval for decades. But as Mohammed mentioned, this history of US meddling in Somalia extends much further back to the time of the dictatorship of Siad Barre. And I think it's important to keep that longer history in mind, particularly when we're presented with mainstream narratives about Somalia as a so-called failed state. Because one, those narratives not only reinforce racialized tropes about Africa, they also fail to account for at least 5 decades of imperial intervention and meddling and for the impact of that meddling on internal stability. So I'll walk us through just a very, very brief outline of Cold War history and then bring us to the War on Terror. Because of its geostrategic location along oil and shipping routes in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden, Somalia was a site of interest for both the US and the Soviet Union as they competed for influence during the Cold War. When Somali President Siad Barre shifted his allegiance away from the Soviet Union to the US in the late 70s and early 80s, Somalia became the second largest recipient of US economic and military aid in Africa, and it used this aid to build the largest army on the continent. But US support declined with the end of the Cold War. With the weakening of the Soviet Union, the US no longer needed Somalia as a counterweight. And in 1990, Congress acknowledged the long record of human rights abuses under Barre's leadership and decided to withhold aid. It didn't take long for the government to then collapse. And in the civil war that ensued, approximately 2 million Somalis were displaced, hundreds of thousands were killed, and nearly 1 million left the country. The UN, then led by the US military, intervened in 1992, ostensibly for humanitarian purposes. But this morphed into a military operation with civilians caught in the crossfire. Opposition to foreign intervention was strong, and several US forces were killed in retaliatory attacks, including the infamous Black Hawk Down incident. And so since then, the US has been reluctant to place its own troops on the ground. If we then fast forward to the War on Terror, with the onset of the War on Terror in 2001, US officials expressed concern about Somalia, about it being a potential safe haven for al-Qaeda operatives. Those articulations and claims were unsubstantiated. But the US had no intention of placing American troops on the ground, particularly in the light of the US military's embarrassing exit in the wake of the Black Hawk Down incident. So instead, it began funneling weapons and money into the country in a CIA bankrolled effort to undermine Somalia's leaders, and it sought to garner support from regional allies who would be ready to deploy their own troops to the front lines. So Ethiopia was the first country to step up and intervene, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in December 2006. And at the time, the country was experiencing the first kind of period of relative stability under the governance of the Islamic Courts Union. But in the wake of the invasion, The Islamic court's leadership was driven into exile, which led more militant factions to come to the fore. So, in effect, the US-backed Ethiopian invasion planted the seeds for the rise of what we now know of as al-Shabaab. The ensuing instability, as we can imagine, produced another round of mass displacement, with many seeking refuge in neighboring Kenya. And here I just want to flag to tie into some of what Muhammad was describing a few minutes ago in terms of the ICE policing practices that we've observed in Minnesota and elsewhere in the country, targeting Somali Americans in particular. Many Somalis who sought refuge in Kenya were then subject to the power of US-trained Kenyan police, whose tactics mirror those that have been recently used by ICE in the US, in the sense that they're masked officers moving around in unmarked vehicles, apprehending people in broad daylight. So I think it's important to make that connection as well, and to think about the ways in which Kenyan policing, with the backing of the United States, has also in some ways served as a laboratory for what we're seeing in the US today. So what happened then in the years subsequent to the Ethiopian invasion? What did the African Union do? What did the United Nations do? Neither of those entities condemned Ethiopia's invasion. Instead, they effectively legitimized it by authoring an African Union-led so-called peacekeeping mission known as AMISOM. Technically, this was a peacekeeping force, but its troops were trained by the US military or by US security companies. And African governments in the region then received security packages in order to send their troops to Somalia. So these included Uganda, Ethiopia to maintain its troop presence, Burundi, Djibouti, and Kenya, which ultimately invaded Somalia in 2011 and then was given the opportunity to maintain its troop presence, to convert essentially its invasion into something legitimate in the form of its participation in the peacekeeping operation. And I just want to flag that, it's important to keep in mind the fact that the US is unwilling to fight its own wars means that it has relied on the racialized labor, of African troops. And it's that labor that has sustained US war making in the region, and it's allowed the US to avoid both the human costs that come with direct combat, as well as allowing it to claim plausible deniability when it comes to accountability for potential war crimes. That peacekeeping mission, known as AMISOM, was initially designated as a 6-month operation, but it soon morphed into an occupation that has persisted until today, 20 years later. Initially, it was framed as requiring the use of force only when necessary, but it gradually assumed an offensive role, engaging in counterinsurgency operations. So this extremely military-heavy approach unfolded in the absence of any significant political efforts to resolve the conflict. And rather than weaken al-Shabaab, military operations exacerbated insecurity, because what we saw was the displacement of al-Shabaab from major urban centers in Somalia that led then to its spread into the wider Horn of Africa region. We've covered the rapid escalation of drone strikes. I just wanted to add that it's in this context that the Pentagon has relied on carefully crafted bureaucratic loopholes that allow it to bypass congressional oversight by relying on foreign military units as surrogates for counterterrorism missions. So alongside the spike in drone strikes, we have all of these policies that have been put in place in recent years, made possible initially by Obama and then developed further by Trump, to rely on proxies effectively. And in 2023, the Costs of War Project at Brown University published a report asserting that the creation of elite military units in Somalia, again, made possible by these bureaucratic loopholes that the US has created, has prompted internal divisions and spurred competition for power among security actors in the country. That report suggests that the scale of US counterterrorism funding for the Somali National Army and for AMISOM, the peacekeeping operation, to the tune of approximately $2.5 billion, has had a distorting effect as Somali political elite have used foreign aid to consolidate their power. So it's with these transactional politics in mind that Somali analyst Abubakar Arman uses the term predatory capitalism to describe the economic interests that shape dynamics on the ground, ultimately perpetuating violence. So if we jump to the current moment, since Trump returned to office last year, the US has been reassessing its strategic position in the region amid growing tensions in the Red Sea arena, primarily in the wake of Houthi attacks that have disrupted the flow of global trade in response to the genocide in Gaza. Part of this policy reassessment has included whether the US should recognize the breakaway region of Somaliland in exchange for access to a military base in order to counter the actions of the Houthis. Although the US has yet to follow Israel in formally recognizing Somaliland, the US military has already been in dialogue with Somaliland leaders about access to an air base there. And overall, both, this fact that the US has been in dialogue with these leaders, the fact that Somaliland has welcomed Israel's recognition, its leaders have recognized its recognition with open arms, all serves as a painful reminder of the power asymmetries that continue to structure the relationship between African leaders and global powers. Because there's a profound irony in Somaliland's desire for recognition as a sovereign state, yet its simultaneous readiness to entertain neo-colonial arrangements. By aligning themselves with the US and Israel, Somaliland leaders have effectively agreed to a form of conditional sovereignty that's contingent upon accepting a new form of subjugation. But at the same time, I just want to zoom out a little bit to think about the response of regional bodies like the African Union, which has insisted upon the importance of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Somalia, which I find to be highly ironic, given that the African Union's own role, the own role that it has played in undermining Somali sovereignty for the past 20 years through its participation in this so-called peacekeeping mission that has contributed to the very instability it claims to want to solve. One could even argue that it's equally ironic to defend the Somali state, given its profound illegitimacy among the Somali people and its own entanglement with US empire, consistently inviting further US involvement rather than less. So what we see is that the political elite, which is true everywhere across the world, continue to prioritize their own interests over the welfare of their people. But I just want to end by turning back to the immediate days in late December after Israel's recognition of Somaliland, when we saw tens of thousands of Somalis taking to the streets in protests. And these crowds converged in multiple cities across the country, in many cases waving both Somali and Palestinian flags. And at stake, I think, for the people taking to the streets was not simply the sovereignty of Somalia, but the question of third world solidarity in the face of efforts by foreign powers to divide people from one another, to divide Somalis from one another, to divide Africans from one another, and peoples of the majority world from one another. In contrast to their political leaders, whose declarations are confined to a minimalist defense of the state, these protesters recognize that the people of Somalia, who have long been subjected to foreign meddling, cannot free themselves from the chokeholds of empire without simultaneously standing in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And I think it's in the domain of people-to-people solidarity that we're more likely to find a clear analysis of how we got here and of what is at stake as we look toward the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Al-Bashir. Dr. Mohammed, would you like to follow?
Yes. Thank you, the Arab Center, DC, and Georgetown African Studies program for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be part of a serious conversation on US policy towards Somalia, especially in this time when Somalia itself has been so caricatured in American national discourse. Now, since we only have a few minutes, I'm going to focus on a few aspects of US policy towards Somalia and its broader trajectory under the Trump administration, some of which might overlap with what my fellow co-panelists have to say, especially Summer. I have to begin, of course, first and foremost with the humanitarian situation. As you can imagine, over the last 3 decades, Somalia has faced a combination of economic fragility, environmental stress, and political instability. Drought cycles, floods, and conflict-related displacement have repeatedly hit the country, and the state institutions have a very limited capacity to respond to these challenges. Just to give a few numbers that would illustrate the scale of this, as of the end of 2024, around 3.1 million Somalis were internally displaced. The unemployment rate is estimated at about 19%, and Somalia is an incredibly young country. Over 70% of the population is under the age of 30, which means youth unemployment is also significantly higher. Now, for years, international humanitarian assistance has filled the gap left by weak domestic institutions. A significant portion of Somalia's food security assistance, especially in rural areas, was provided through US aid. Before the recent funding cuts, about 2.2 million Somalis were receiving emergency food assistance through aid programs. By April 2025, that number had already dropped to about 1.1 million, so that's half. And projections from the World Food Program towards the end of last year suggested that it would fall to as low as 350,000. So from 2.2 million people to 350,000, covering fewer than 1 in every 10 people who were in need of food aid for survival. As you can imagine, the consequences are very tangible. So clinics have closed or scaled back operations, vaccination campaigns have been disrupted, and we're starting to see the reemergence of communicable diseases in areas where public health coverage has collapsed. Malnutrition, of course, only exacerbates people's vulnerability to disease. Now, to be fair, donor fatigue has been building for years, or what is termed donor fatigue. Many countries have been gradually reducing foreign aid spending long before the Trump administration, but the speed and the abruptness of the recent cuts, particularly to programs historically funded through US aid, has had immediate and severe consequences. And the structural issue in Somalia is that many basic services, food distribution, primary healthcare, even elements of the public health system, are effectively outsourced to international aid programs, right? So in other words, humanitarian assistance has functioned as a substitute for state capacity. It's neoliberal governance par excellence. But ideally, the long-term solution would involve strengthening Somali institutions so that these services could be delivered domestically, but that has really rarely been the central focus of US engagement during and before the Trump administration. Which brings me to the second point, which is this security-first framework through which the US approaches Somalia. Now, American policy towards the country has been dominated by security concerns for decades, even before the Somali Civil War began in 1991. As Summer was telling us, the United States maintained close ties with Somalia's government and provided significant amounts of military assistance. But since the beginning of the War on Terror, that relationship has evolved into a multifaceted security infrastructure involving supporting African Union troops, federal and state level militaries, training the done-up special forces, and direct US airstrikes and covert operations in the country. Now, another important piece of this picture is who is actually doing the fighting on the ground. So a large share of international funding tied to the African Union mission flows to troop contributing countries whose forces are formally part of that mission, but in practice, much of the day-to-day combat against al-Shabaab in southern Somalia in large-scale offensive has been carried out by the SNA, the Somali National Army, and local clan militias known as the Mawisle. These local forces have played a critical role in pushing al-Shabaab out of a number of rural areas over the past few years, yet they often operate with limited resources, uneven logistical support, and weak institutional backing. So there's a persistent disconnect between where international security funding goes and where the fighting actually happens. And there's also a longer-term issue here when a central government increasingly subcontracts core security functions to clan militias, as well as these occupation forces, as Summer has described them. It can create its own political and institutional problems down the line. It's essentially, once again, like neoliberal governance par excellence, but that's a much bigger discussion and not really, the focus here. But with regards to like the United States direct involvement, I'm going to give a few statistics to like really make this clear. In 2025 alone, the US carried out 125 airstrikes and 1 ground raid in Somalia. So for comparison, 125 compared to 51 operations during the entirety of the Biden administration. And the pace hasn't slowed down. Already in 2026, the US has carried out at least 28 operations, which is more than any full year under a non-Trump president. Estimates suggest that between 172 and 359 people have been killed in strikes during Trump's second term so far, but these numbers are highly uncertain. To put this in perspective, the entire US campaign targeting alleged drug trafficking, which itself was illegitimate, in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific since last fall has consisted of 34 strikes. So Somalia has been one of the most active theaters for US air operations anywhere in the world, despite receiving very little coverage in the United States. However, despite the intensity of these operations, the broader strategy remains unclear. Washington's current approach essentially seeks to contain the threat posed by al-Shabaab, but it isn't really connected to any long-term strategy for managing or resolving the conflict. That approach might make sense if the US intends to basically remain in Somalia forever, but Somalis cannot rely on that, nor should US policymakers, and it doesn't really seem like that's their interest. But without a broader political strategy, containment risks being like a permanent lopsided military approach to a conflict that fundamentally requires political and economic solutions, including a need to deal with the underlying issues that produce the fragile security conditions. And this reflects a deeper issue. For decades, Somalia has often been treated in Washington less as a partner than as a site of policy experimentation, a place where counterterrorism tools, remote warfare, and security partnerships are tested without a comparable investment in political institutions or economic recovery. Meanwhile, the security architecture itself provides perverse incentives. Large flows of money move through contractors, regional security forces, militias, and political elites, creating opportunities for corruption and rent seeking at nearly every level. Civilian casualties also have, besides being incredibly immoral, have strategic consequences because they reinforce narratives of foreign intervention. And as Summer was saying, help delegitimize the Somali government, which continues to invite foreign intervention, and provide propaganda opportunities for groups like al-Shabaab. And if we're being honest about the history of intervention here, there's also a strong argument that the US needs to be paying reparations for civilian victims of military operations. I think every few months I see a new article about families whose loved ones have been killed in US strikes during this Trump administration, previous Trump administration, and other American administrations seeking out reparations for the loss of their loved ones. Now, finally, just to talk briefly about this current war, US-Israeli war on Iran, and some of the kind of consequences it might have for Somalia, even though the country is not directly involved. According to the last annual report by the Somali central government, 3 of Somalia's major trading partners are located in the Gulf. That's the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. And these are critical export destinations, as well as important places from which Somalia receives imports, especially food and fuel. So any disruptions to shipping routes, energy markets, or regional trade flows in the Gulf could quickly translate to higher prices and supply shocks inside Somalia. For a country already facing humanitarian strain and economic fragility, these external shocks could be extremely destabilizing. Just to conclude, stepping back, the central contradiction in US policy towards Somalia is fairly clear. On one hand, there's this expansive and increasingly active counterterrorism campaign. On the other hand, the humanitarian, economic, and institutional foundations needed for long-term stability are being steadily weakened and very much defunded. As long as Somalia continues to be approached primarily as a counterterrorism theater rather than as a political and developmental challenge, the cycle of instability is likely to continue. And ultimately, that approach isn't sustainable for Somalia or for American policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aman. That was very, very helpful. There's a lot coming all together, and I really see so much there. And we will conclude with you, Dr. Waldemariam. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for having me to the Arab Center of Washington, D.C. And it was really great to hear from my fellow panelists. As I suspected, I learned a ton from them. What I wanted to do with the few minutes I have was just to offer some reflections on security dynamics in the broader Horn of Africa, and sort of say a few things about how they are impacting Somalia. And I think the main kind of point that I want to make is that the regional picture around Somalia has undergone some really volatile transformations, I would say, over the last 7 to 8 years, maybe we could sort of say over the last decade. And those transformations I think are worth considering. And my analysis will I think echo and hopefully build on some of the really good points made by both Samar and Iman. So, up until I would say about 2017, 2018, kind of in that, right around that sort of juncture, external engagement in Somalia was really anchored on a sort of compact, right, between Somalia's neighbors and the West, right? And this has, I think, already come up in our conversation. And it basically involved sort of Western actors supporting, quote unquote, frontline states, primarily Ethiopia and Kenya, Djibouti to some extent, countries that don't border Somalia like Uganda and Burundi, in countering al-Shabaab and, creating some kind of space for a reconstitution or what was viewed as a reconstitution of the Somali state. I mean, that support that was extended to these frontline actors or called frontline actors was both financial and military. And again, this has been discussed. The African Union, UN structures were some of the mechanisms through which this arrangement was put into effect, right? You had AMISOM, ATMIS, now we have AUSOM, you had UNSOM. I mean, just a whole kind of multi-billion-dollar architecture supporting this arrangement. At the time, right, I mean, when this really began to take shape initially in 2007, 2008, this was really framed as kind of African solutions to African problems, right? It took place under the aegis of that framework. Although, I think as this panel has already suggested, you can debate whether that was really what this was about. And I think the effect, I mean, the what this approach produced was more or less political and military stalemate in Somalia. We could sort of discuss that and map that out. But I think it did work for the US, the Europeans, and their neighbors, right? Whether it worked in Somalia is a different a different question. But I think for these external actors, this was viable, right? For the West, they sort of put a ceiling, on the al-Shabaab problem. It was kind of contained. Again, I think this came up earlier for the most part. For countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, they got a lot of diplomatic leverage vis-a-vis the West, no question about it. And we're also able to kind of legitimate their engagement in Somalia and sort of shape a lot of political dynamics within it, including through their strong backing of regional administrations in places like Puntland, Jubaland, and some other regional administrations as well. Um, and there was a juncture at which, not a whole lot could happen politically, even in Mogadishu, without kind of the approval of these key neighbors, right? But I would contend that this kind of old formula has basically collapsed, right? And I would say there are kind of three overlapping forces at play. So one has to do with what's happened in the neighbors, and maybe I'll just focus on Ethiopia specifically here. You could probably have a parallel analysis in Kenya. But, Ethiopia had always been kind of the senior regional partner on the Somalia file. I mean, Kenya and Ethiopia have a defense treaty that goes back to 1964. I mean, their relations haven't always been always been warm, but that was an arrangement that was always directed at Somalia, right? Ethiopia goes through a significant leadership transition in 2018. It's associated with a lot of instability and conflict. And so on one level, and perhaps the less interesting level, they become just much less able to project power into Somalia. I think that's certainly a feature of what we've seen since 2018 Ethiopia-Somali relations. But the other piece is that Ethiopian foreign policy in Somalia also gets a lot more unpredictable. There are kind of two big examples of this. I mean, the first is when the new government Addis comes to power in 2018, its initial approach to Somalia is really to rapidly disengage rather, from the regional administrations, from Somaliland that had been a historic partner for them, and to kind of throw their support to sort of, then President Formaggio. So he's kind of given the green light by Ethiopia to kind of consolidate political power. If for those of you that were following this at the time, this was all part of this tripartite deal, right, between Formaggio, President Isaias of Eritrea, and Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia. And it had a lot of different effects across the region. But in Somalia, it is one of the things I think that led to a pretty significant political crisis that culminates in this big electoral showdown in 2022, right? That almost leads to open between Farmajo and his adversaries, that almost leads to open war in Mogadishu. I think another really good example, and maybe the one that was more visible to all of us, was really relates to kind of Ethiopia's sea access agenda, that's directed toward a number of parts in the Horn. But on New Year's Day of 2024, Ethiopia signs what at the time was a highly controversial MOU with Somaliland that triggers probably the most serious diplomatic confrontation between Ethiopia and Somalia since, I would say probably the Cold War era. Turkey mediates that a year later, but I think relations are still really quite complicated. Now, the second dynamic that's at play, I think, is, and others have picked up on this, is a kind of waning, Western commitment to what might be called, again, the stabilization, state building project in Somalia, at least as it existed in the past. Let's put aside for a moment kind of the Trump administration's very significant escalation of airstrikes in Somalia, which I think is reminiscent of his first term, but I view mostly as kind of performative. I mean, highly consequential to Somalis, no question about it. But the strikes are not really about Somalia, in my view, right? They are the more general drive that we see in other parts of the world to kind of unconstrain the U.S. military, right, and U.S. military power. But what you then see is, I think, a sort of pretty clear Western recalibration in Somalia. I mean, Trump pulled U.S. forces out of Somalia very rapidly at the end of his first term. That was mostly a training mission, although Biden then brings them back. The Pentagon had resisted that at the time, or resisted the removal of those troops from Somalia. There is an increasing reluctance from the US and Europeans to fund AU forces in Somalia, as well as Somali forces. The EU has at times cut salaries to soldiers. The Biden administration blocked the application of what was called Resolution 2717 to AU forces in Somalia. So this would have essentially allowed for using UN assessed contributions to fund a big portion of the AU mission in Somalia. And the US blocked it. And then you see like this emerging discourse in Washington, particularly in Republican circles, around deepening ties with Somaliland, perhaps even up to recognition. And I think the subtext, or maybe not the subtext, I think it's more explicit, is Somaliland is an alternative, right, to Mogadishu in terms of engagement, because in this view, engagement with Mogadishu is not working. The state building project is not working. I mean, that's the narrative, right? And I think that's still a very live debate in Washington at the moment. Now, for neighboring countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, this is prompting a bit of a rethink. They are asking, okay, how far will the West go in disengaging Somalia? They're even asking, could they, a la what happened in Afghanistan, broker some kind of arrangement with al-Shabaab that would facilitate their exit? The neighbors are very nervous about this, obviously. And they're asking, okay, what should they do to potentially fill the vacuum if indeed one is created? They're kind of really grasping for a path forward. Now, a final dynamic, I've mentioned two here, right? I've mentioned what's happened with the neighbors, Ethiopia, a good illustration. I've talked about sort of Western recalibration. I think a final dynamic is that as this old model of external engagement in Somalia has withered, this basic compact between African leaders and the West, the Gulf, Turkey, Egypt, and now indeed even Israel have filled the gap. And this, of course, is reflective of a broader transformation across the Horn of Africa. It extends to other major hotspots in the Horn. We could tell a parallel story in Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia dynamics, which are quite hot right now. But I think the basic gist is that in Somalia, as in these other zones, we have competing kind of extra-regional camps shaping political dynamics. I think Mogadishu, President Hassan Sheikh has kind of doubled down on the relationship with Turkey. He's brought the Egyptians into the AU force, an endeavor, perhaps potentially from some of the reporting we've seen, it's being paid for by the Saudis. And then the key federal member states, Somaliland, have built pretty strong partnerships with the UAE, right? That persist, of course, despite the fact that Mogadishu has just downgraded in a very significant way some of its engagements with the UAE, including in the security cooperation field. Now, it's anyone's guess how, this war in the Gulf, the conflict that's, centered on Iran, kind of rejigs this dynamic in Somalia in the Horn. I think, Aman, you spoke about this quite well. I think those of us that focus in the Horn are really asking, all of us are asking this question, like, what are the ripple effects in the Horn? There are many, I think. But my bottom line is I think this sort of Gulf Turkish engagement in Somalia and the Horn is probably going to be resilient. I think we're looking at a long-term structural transformation of kind of the politics of the Horn. And so I will stop there and again have really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you all. Really thought-provoking interventions on a number of aspects, and I particularly appreciate that each of you has really historicized this, right? This is not every time Somalia comes up, not only is it sort of securitized, but it's also historicized, not always, but regularly, as if we're in a moment that exists without history. And each of you in your own way has brought that important history to each of these topics, and that really struck me as I was listening to your comments. So thank you so much for that. But also the fact that, that things that are happening in this very moment will have significant repercussions for Somalia and Somalis that are hard to predict. And so thanks for that. There are some questions sort of popping up, but I think one thing, and maybe it came from something you were saying, Mike. I mean, you framed it as like, some of what we see in Somalia, and I think this is something that makes sense, are things that we see in sort of the global sense, right? The sort of way in which might makes right is the game of politics today. It's being tested by so many authoritarians and authoritarian wannabes in ways that are emboldened by particularly the actions of the current regime in Washington, but others as well. And so my question is sort of like going back to, the drones, for example, right? And Samar's really important point about the fact that I think you called it a laboratory of making war or unending war, if I wrote it down correctly. Somalia as this laboratory of war, right? What features of this is sort of emblematic of power in the world today, but what features of this is distinctly Somali? If there's any of that maybe we want to just sort of highlight, and then I do want to get to the audience questions, because I think, at least for me, some of this is distinctly Somali and Somalia and its own history in the region and in sort of the Cold War and war on terror contexts that are not like other places in spaces. So if anybody wanted to sort of touch on that, or I can go to the questions in the audience, but that's sort of what struck me as a thread throughout what each of you has said, including for Somali Americans in the diaspora, right? Ways in which there are intersections with other racialized solidarities and so on, but ways in which Somalis as Black Americans, for example, in the diaspora are distinct from other groups in the ways that they're surveilled or sort of. So I'll throw that out there. Do you want me to bring maybe a couple other questions, and then you can see those? There are a number that are here in the chat, and I can read them out. I think a couple we've addressed a little, so I'll just read them for the audience, and you can think if you want. Israel's recognition of Somaliland, what strategic objectives is it seeking, and is it a long-term commitment? I mean, maybe that's the question we haven't answered as much. Significant differences between Biden and Trump towards Somalia, maybe in strategic interests as opposed to just sort of the kinds of decisions about military actions. What would it take from the Somali government to end U.S. military campaigns and encourage a more constructive engagement. Maybe I'll end with that one, and if there are any of those, and then we can kind of do another batch. Are there any of those that anyone would like to take up? We have plenty of time for discussion.
I'm happy to start, and I'll let people take things. So I was thinking about the question you asked, Lara, about what makes Somalia distinctive. And I think one thing I think is like, I mean, a lot of times like Somalis are often, and the Horn in general is often accused of like being treated as kind of this exceptional case, right? Like there are so many things about it that are that's actually very parallel with what's going on in whatever historical moment that's happening elsewhere in the world. But one thing I think is unique about Somalia is that it is like one of the first places in the unipolar order that had this like dramatic state collapse, and then on top of that, a so-called humanitarian mission in this kind of like period of liberal humanitarianism transformed into this kind of state building mission, which would then be followed by attempts in Afghanistan and Iraq, like American attempts to kind of build this. So I think Somalia, because it's so peripheral, has been a place where, like Summer was saying, there's all of this kind of, it's a laboratory where the US under the cover of darkness can do all of this experimentation, and some of those tools are then exported to other places without learning any kind of like the lessons, or perhaps like different lessons are learned, but not necessarily to great effect, as we can see as US intervention in Afghanistan has produced. And the other thing about the other question I've been thinking about is how can the Somali government discourage US intervention or military intervention or Western military intervention? And I think, quite frankly, like it cannot, because I think there's a real and genuine fear that, like what happened in Afghanistan, that the government would collapse without the backing of African Union troops at this stage, because of the way that the brittleness of the institutions. And I mean, I hope other people might have a better answer, but I think like it would really collapse and not have, and the consequences, like Michael was saying about, the fear of neighboring states, of what would happen to the entire region if that did happen, would be quite grave and scary.
I can jump in just very briefly and then I'll pass it over to you, Mike. I just wanted to flag for the participants a report I think that is of great relevance for our discussion today. And it's a report published by the International Crisis Group in 2021 called Overkill. And in that report, they trace the history of the use and the invocation of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force that came into effect after 9/11. And it traces the ways in which the authorization for the use of military force has been expanded over the years to encompass geographies that were not initially conceived to be the source of genuine threat to the United States. And Somalia is a perfect example. They actually trace in the report how Africa in general, but Somalia in particular, is an overlooked geography in which we've seen that expansive use of military force in a completely, unchecked way. And specifically what matters here is that it grants the executive branch far more authority to engage in war making without needing the consent of Congress. And so when I use the language of laboratory, that's what I'm referring to in order to capture this expansive war-making power that is made available to the president without needing congressional approval. And the report equally references the desire by the Pentagon to, quote, keep Africa out of the headlines, right? They wanted to be able to pursue their war-making strategies without considerable scrutiny. And I think what also differentiates the Somalia case is that even though at the end of the day, Congress isn't involved, What the White House does and has done in Somalia is give special operations forces on the ground far more authority than they have typically enjoyed and held in other geographies. So that kind of dispersal of power to special operations forces, where people in Washington defer to their expertise and don't feel the need to check, what it is they're doing and why. I'll turn it to you, Mike.
Great, thanks. So maybe I'll take up two questions. I mean, this, Lara, your question about kind of, is Somalia, or maybe we could say the Horn more broadly, kind of reflective of a broader global, of sort of broader shifts around the globe? I would say yes, but it's also playing out in distinctive ways. And I think one concern I have, there's a lot of hand-wringing nowadays about sort of the end of the so-called rules-based order, right? Which I don't think actually really ever applied to the Horn or Africa, right? But, I do think that this kind of increasingly kind of prominent logic of kind of might makes right does have some particular implications for the Horn. I mean, if we look at, Gaza, Venezuela, now Iran, because the Horn is, and, the collapse of norms around use of force, territorial integrity. I mean, this has distinctive impacts in the Horn because this is a region, I mean, already quite volatile, but this is also a place where like borders have always kind of been up for grabs, right? And you layer on top of that sort of shifting global norms, and it can be quite dangerous. We're seeing that in the Horn right now, right? And I'm not sure you would necessarily see that same kind of territorial contestation even in other parts of the continent, right? So that's one piece. On, strategic objectives of, Israel and the Somaliland recognition deal. I mean, I think this came up earlier. Some of this is probably about the Houthis. It's also kind of an alignment between the UAE and Israel. I mean, the UAE has, I think, quietly been supportive of Somaliland's recognition. But, I also do think it's worth thinking about this from Somaliland's perspective, and kind of their strategic incentives, I think, are also relevant here, because they obviously know the engagement with Israel carries significant risk as well, and they had to weigh that. And I think their view has probably been, this is kind of a dangerous time in the world in the Horn, changes in the neighbors, increasing influence from the Gulf countries and Turkey. So like no time to kind of wait on recognition. We sort of have to move quickly. And you see the logic building. I mean, there was their strategic engagement with Taiwan that, got them into hot water with China. There was the Ethiopia MOU, and now this thing with Israel. And so they are, clearly kind of accepting some risk to try and sort of advance the recognition agenda. And they have their own, there's a calculus there for them that I think is relevant here.
Great. I can move on to some other questions and we can see what else folks are saying. Thank you for all of that. Reminder to the audience, also feel free to put some questions in the Q&A. I see some are coming through. I wanted to pop down. There's a question about public opinion, and that is tricky. So I think it would be interesting to hear from our panel. Someone is asking, are there differences in public opinion on the prospects of political settlements with al-Shabaab within the Somali diaspora and inside Somalia itself? That's one question that hopefully one of you might want to touch on for us. There's also a question about, are the Global South and African nations able to play a significant role in countering U.S. militarism? So sort of to add on, Iman, to your specific addressing of Somalia, but more generally, maybe within the region. What else? I think I skipped over a few, so let me go back up. If the U.S. were to recognize Somaliland, how would you expect major regional players to respond? And I think actually we kind of sort of already touched on that as well. Let me just look and see if there's any others that we haven't. Yeah, and maybe this also, I think, speaks to Mohammed, some of your work. Trump used a propaganda and disinformation campaign against Somali Americans, much like other communities. Are there efforts to fact check or push back against these racist narratives? I think you had talked a bit about resistance, so maybe we can hear more about that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of engage that rhetoric. And there's a question on the vilification of Somalis and Somali Americans, right? Part of it too is not just sort of the war on terror and Islamophobia, right? But you also have um, uh, sort of film and cultural objects really playing a significant force in the racialization of Somalis, right? Primarily the films Captain Phillip and Black Hawk Down, sort of the one of the more powerful narratives of Somalis as pirates, as threats, right? Steeping into the public consciousness, right? And so you have these various ways from the 90s, 2000s on in which Somalis are racialized and re-racialized in various ways, right? Particularly with the most recent film, sort of Captain Phillips, right? The discourse of Somali pirates and Somali piracy entering. But in terms of countering the racialization of Somalis, right? I encourage everybody in here to go read my book, Black Muslim Refugee Militarism Policing, right? Because part of what I really do is to challenge these ideas of one, Somalis as ungrateful refugees who refuse to assimilate and who are destabilizing the United States by committing fraud, by really showing that the arrival of Somali refugees in the United States is a product of U.S. imperialism, right? Refugees are products of empire, right? And that the U.S. has a moral obligation to accept refugees because they produce the conditions for the flight and the destabilization of the state, right? And so, really, it takes the burden away from Somalis as and immigration narratives as problems for the state, right? Immigrants are problems that the state has to solve, to really show the ways in which the state and the U.S. has continued to be destructive in its engagement with Somalis in Somalia and in the diaspora as well, right? The ability of Somalis, quote unquote, to assimilate and access upward mobility in this country is completely destabilized by systemic racism in this country, right? Anti-blackness, Islamophobia, the targeting of sort of Somali communities, and in many ways, right? U.S. involvement in Somalia isn't just geopolitics, right? It is inherently stymied by racism, right? And racialized discourses that dehumanize entire groups of people, right? And that these racial discourses travel across space and time, right? So, as Iman was saying, as I write about in my book, the drone strikes that had killed Somali civilians, some as young as infants, is directly linked to the dehumanization of Somali Americans who are targeted for ICE raids, who have been murdered by police, right? And racial discourses of othering and dehumanization have been necessary, right? But it has been that same diaspora that the U.S. created in America that has been at the forefront of critiquing the racialization of Somalis, of challenging U.S. empire and arguing that the U.S. Um, will never leave Somalia alone until we really address what is happening to Somali diaspora and Somalia as imperialism, right? And Iman can probably attest to this as a historian. Um, I really also want to highlight that Somalis have resisted foreign incursions into our lands for hundreds of years, right? That there has always been within Somali community an anti-imperialist stance going as far back as the colonial period. And I sort of argue that this is just another manifestation of this in our current moment, where now you have this massive diaspora that has taken on this anti-imperialist stance in relation to what the U.S. is doing, right? And of course, in relation to what other future foreign empire, right, takes interest in Somalia, as Samar has mentioned, because of its strategic location on the Horn. Somalia will always be a space that foreign powers are interested in having some access or control, forever threatening the sovereignty of Somalis. So I think the counter discourses to this racialization of Somalis is really prevalent within the diaspora, right? Not only the work of activists, but the work of scholars, right? The work of teachers, the work of Somali artists, filmmakers, right? Poets, fiction writers, right? Have really been doing tremendous amount to counter the massive manufacturing of images of Somalis as terrorists, of threats that are produced by U.S. Hollywood, the media, the state, right? And so I think there is this interplay between the dominant narrative and the counter narratives that are emerging from the diaspora. Yes, but yes, shout out to my book. So if you want this counter narrative, please read Black Muslim Refugee. It really does counter almost a decade of the racialization of Somalis as terrorists and in the United States and as criminals and as fraudsters, right, by putting an onus on the state.
I can take the question about what can African states and the Global South do to resist U.S. militarism, which is a very important question, and I hope others will also chime in on this. So really, that question forces us to confront the structural inequalities that continue to shape relations between African states and the United States. And between the global South and the U.S. more broadly. And by this, I mean, confronting the neoliberal economic policies that have been imposed on African states by the World Bank and the IMF that have led to privatization, an emphasis on privatization and divestment from social services, and the consequential desperation of African states. The framework of security has been the almost only framework through which to obtain funds. So that positions African states, sadly, more in line with the United States, and with U.S. militarism than it does against U.S. militarism. And in concrete terms, there's money available for training and equipping African police forces, for funding and training African militaries. And as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, it's those police forces and militaries that are then asked to go to the front lines to fight many of the wars that the US doesn't want to fight on its own, right? And so even though we will see symbolic gestures, right, and invocations of resistance to the US at different moments in time, where we might see some African states challenging the US, in material terms, they're very, very much working in concert with the US in this, spread of militarism across the continent. And that was on painful display when Biden hosted the US-Africa Summit, where you could argue that the African leaders who had been invited, first of all, those that are given a center stage at those gatherings are those that are very, very closely aligned with the US and security interests. And you could argue that those leaders were engaged in what we might refer to as empire by invitation. They were wanting more US security assistance, more of US engagement on the ground rather than less. So this is a real problem, I think, confronting us, and why there's, I think, more hope from within the people, from within the masses of populations across the continent, rather than from the leadership itself.
I can jump in and slightly build on what Summer was saying. I mean, I 100% agree that I think, if you look at the case of Somalia and the troop contributing countries, so much of their militaries are funded by this particular intervention in Somalia, or the UN, not the UN, the European Union states and Arab Gulf states, and some of the United States providing training and funding for these troop contributing countries. And so if you have a large and bloated military and you need them to be busy and not, causing you domestic problems, sending them to Somalia where they get good salaries that they can send home is actually a fantastic way to deal with a particularly difficult domestic institution. And so I think that, yeah, I agree with Summer's point about how global South states are structurally constrained by the particular economic relations and dependencies that they have with global North powers. The last thing I wanted to say was about this question of public opinion on settlement with al-Shabaab. I mean, I think that question presumes that public opinion has a significant role in Somali politics. Unfortunately, what we've seen, especially in the public institutions that exist, I mean, there is a robust public sphere in Somalia. I mean, every Somali has so many political opinions, and Fad Kudirir is like such a big part of Somali culture, but there's no translation of any of that into particular policy outcomes or constraints on, or significant constraints on public institutions, especially at a national level. But regardless, I do think that there is an interest for stability in having some kind of political settlement of this, more than 3 decades long conflict, and more than 2 decades for the particular war on terror phase of it. But unfortunately, I don't think that there is any particular way to fix it because of the structural constraints from kind of the dissolution of political sovereignty in the Horn of Africa. What Mike was saying about how the Horn is this place where so-called rules-based order of this the proliferation of this kind of network state model of where different parts of Somalia are essentially logistics hubs for various foreign powers to meddle, to seek out access to the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea, or to capture particular commercial routes, or to have particular other types of interests fulfilled. So I don't think that the particular political arrangements in Somalia at the moment are conducive to that. And then even at the national federal level, even if the Somali federal government tried, and I do think that there have been attempts under this administration and previous Somali administrations to find a political settlement with al-Shabaab, al-Shabaab simply has a stronger hand to play, and they have a role in this as well. And I'm not quite sure that there is any interest in figuring that out, in trying to find a way to settle. There's a mutual perception of illegitimacy, and so at the moment, I think we're just going to be in this stalemate for a very long time. And I think international policy has made it so that containment and maintaining the stalemate is the preferred outcome for a lot of powers.
I think we have time for just a couple more, unless there's a few there that you all can see. I think there's a comment that maybe I'll just read, and I'll pose one last question, and then you can say any last things you want to say. There's a comment from someone in the audience saying, "This is just a comment. I think as a Somali diaspora, we've realized globally that Somalia is systematically being suppressed to progress and prevented from being a sovereign nation." I'm just reading this deliberately. "And that our neighbors such as Kenya and Ethiopia enjoy this policy towards Somalia." So sort of bringing in perhaps some of the benefits to regional neighbors from the kinds of stalemates and instability that you've all raised. Someone else asked, "In many cases, Somali civilians receive very limited information about the US airstrikes targeting groups like al-Shabaab. Is there any way how can transparency and communication with the Somali public be improved so that counterterrorism efforts are understood and do not undermine trust in the state or international partners?" That or any other comments that anybody would like to make, and then I think we'll start to wrap up. Any last thoughts in addition to addressing any of the questions that you see there in the Q&A?
I'll jump in briefly to one of the questions. How could transparency with the Somali public be improved, right? I think there's been a tremendous lack of transparency to what the U.S. has been doing in their counterterrorism programs in the United States, right? Particularly in Minneapolis and in San Diego. That's primarily because the U.S. state does not make a distinction between Somali civilians and terrorists, right? This is where it's important to sort of study racialization, right? It's the idea that all Somalis are possible threats regardless of gender, right, of age, right. This is the process in which people become criminalized, and so the transparency isn't given to sort of Somalis, right? Somalis are actually information needs to be withheld from them because Somalis are perceived and are racialized as the threat that needs to be neutralized, which is very different than other refugee communities that have come prior to Somalis, right? Who have been able to access different levels of assimilation or upward mobility in the United States, but Somalis have really been rendered as a threat that the state needs to neutralize rather than objects of the state's rescue, right? And so there will never either in Somalia itself or in the diaspora be transparency to what the U.S. is doing, right, in regards to surveillance, assaults, the sending of confidential informants, the hiring of Somalis to work in the FBI to surveil the community, right? It is a systemic and mass surveillance of this community that is racialized as a threat, right? And that's why it's really important to understand how power and race operate in relation to state violence, right? It is not just an objective enterprise targeting people who they have credible evidence that they've committed crimes, right? It is creating criminality, right? The racial discourses produce criminality rather than target criminality as it exists. And I think it's really important to sort of understand criminology literature, right? Critical race theory literature, public scholarship on race, to really show, right, the way the state justifies its actions, right? And so, to kind of answer that question, right? There's a lot. I did a lot of research for my book, and it was very hard to get a hold of state documents that were explicit in what they were doing. But a lot of the interviews I did were showing the hidden operations of the state, the things the government was doing, the targeting of people, the wiretapping of people's phone lines, the people being followed, right, so on and so forth. I think there is much more um, potential to expose state violence from the diaspora itself and the community than there is the state's capacity to ever. But of course, anybody who studies the U.S. government, can see that secrecy has really been central to the operation of violence, going as far back as the targeting of the Black Panther Party, civil rights activists, right, in the 1960s, and earlier, right, the targeting of sort of Black communities for surveillance, right, and the criminalization of sort of Black people writ large in this country.
I can jump in briefly, and perhaps just to add to this discussion of transparency, I wanted to flag that there have been slight differences between the Democratic and the Republican administrations over the course of the last 20 years, and I can point specifically to the Biden administration deciding that it would enact policies that would build in more protections for civilians into its drone strike policy. But what's important here is that that actually masks, that this attempt to prove that the Biden administration is being more humane, it actually masks the continuity of war, right? And what we've seen over the last 25 years is a growing reliance on the law and on the discourse of transparency to paper over the fact that war continues, right? So the fact that the US government may be more transparent about how many people it killed and where it killed them is not enough, right? The war has to stop. The killing has to stop. So that's number one. And I think there's a real risk, on the one hand, we want there to be more attention to what's happening in a place like Somalia and in Africa in general, but there's a risk of falling into that trap, right, of simply calling for more transparency, and that is not enough. The second point I wanted to make is that I think there's a parallel here, right? That in order to garner the attention of the American public to what's happening in Somalia, the tendency is to focus on the drone strikes, right? Drone strikes are a spectacular form of US power, right? In the meantime, there are much more mundane, less visible forms of violence that are playing out on a daily basis in Somalia and across the continent as a whole. And so it's really important that we don't fall into that trap, right? Of that fixation with spectacular violence, because there's so much more to the story that we need to understand. And part of that story is the imbrication of African troops in fighting US wars on the ground. They're the ones who are, structurally positioned in this fundamentally unequal way, right? That they're subjected to violence by virtue of their position vis-a-vis the US military. At the same time, they're the ones enacting violence, right, on African people. And so I think expanding our lens to the everyday will help us see, those layers of violence and power that are at play.
I think we only have a couple of minutes. So Mike, I can give you the last word. And Aman, we could give a minute each, or what do you think? Okay, we'll let Mike have the last word. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a very good question. One of the last questions about the kind of connection between kind of the anti-Somali discourse in the United States and U.S.-Somali relations. And we've kind of talked about this, but I mean, I think the two are they're linked, albeit perhaps indirectly. I mean, the kind of pathologizing of Somalis, Somali Americans, Somalis, the kind of narrative of a failure. You know, it is obviously right now domestically anchored, but I think obviously you can see layers to that and you can see it kind of repeated also in kind of the foreign policy discourse as well, right? As the US thinks about how it recalibrates in Somalia today, right? That the situation is not salvageable, et cetera. I mean, so I definitely think there's connective tissue, and others have pointed it out. It's just maybe not direct, more indirect.
Well, on behalf of our large audience today, reflective of the importance of this topic, I want to thank each of our panelists. I have certainly learned a lot, and I know that many others have. I want to thank the audience for some great questions that got us thinking about these things. We've got a lot to read, certainly Mohammed's book, but many other things as well, and most of all, to continue to pay attention to Somalia, Somalis all over the world, and to the Horn of Africa region. Going to be incredibly important in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Thank you all for your time, and we'll look forward